And so a lot of times families, it's very understandable, but they personalize every little thing, or they go to their loved one assuming to have this rational conversation about something that's so obvious that you could see 20/20 that they clearly need help, but they're not ready. So through the program, through our work, I coach parents to match and mirror, right? And also create discrepancies, because we always want to create and search for ambivalence, meaning that there's definitely some aspect of your loved one's life that, as much as they may not be ready for sobriety, they sure don't love every aspect. And there's ways we can leverage that. Welcome to the Four Peaks Parents Podcast with Thomas Miller. Are you tired of your tweens, teens, and young adults' negative behaviors and poor choices holding you emotionally hostage, controlling your family, and ruling your life? If you answered yes, then you are in the right place. This podcast is a community for courageous parents just like you who come here to gain effective tools, skills, and take action so they can change their tween, teen, or young adult's life and improve their family's future. Hey everyone, welcome to the Four Peaks Parents Podcast with your host, Thomas Miller. This is, in theory, the second part of a two-part series on alcohol or substance abuse. However, each of them stand alone, and so today's part is called Now What? A Parent's Guide to Facing a Teen or Young Adult's Substance Use Problem. The first one was really about helping to understand the stages of addiction, right? And a couple of just quick key takeaways were to make sure that, number one, we know what the heck the 5 stages of substance use are, and I'll run through them again just to bring you back up to speed from last week. So it's experimentation, right? We want to really think about, like, why is this happening? Is it because of curiosity, peer pressure, or rite of passage? What does it look like? Are they trying a drink at a party? Are they vaping with friends once or twice? The parent tip here, like the key takeaway, if your child's experimenting, don't immediately freak the heck out and panic. I understand it's really important to be present and to be active and to do something. Please hear me that we always want to be proactive. However, it's a signal to start the conversation, not clamp down, right? Teachable moments galore in that experimentation. Second phase is social or occasional use. Again, why is this happening? We always want to ask that. Why is it happening? Is it a way to fit in? Are they reducing social anxiety? Are they trying to join a friend group? Are they, is there popularity at stake? What the heck is driving it, right? What does that look like? Well, could be drinking at every party, but not alone. Still functioning okay. Parent tip, right? Watch for frequency and context. You're going to hear words like everyone's doing it. That is the most common refrain you'll hear from teens and or young adults. Again, they're always trying to normalize their behavior. They're always trying to make you seem like the stick in the mud, and they never want to be outside the norm of what they deem to be peer normative, which is why they may have changed friends, and now as their use is deepening, they're finding people that also are normalizing or deepening their use, right? Regular use, why is it happening, right? These are great questions to ask yourself. It's now becoming a habit. It might be every weekend. They might even be doing it after school. One little pro tip I forgot to mention in the last episode is most parents assume kids do drink or drug, right? Or use on the weekends, which they do. But the big time is actually 3 to 5:30, 3 to 6, because that's when it's abyss of structure. All that unstructured time is, and lack of supervision because parents aren't home, etc. So just be mindful of that. That's why things like, sports, hobbies, job, anything after school is a huge protective factor. So if now we're in a regular use, not only is it becoming a habit, they might be seeking out substances more consistently. Grades might start dipping. Mood or sleep changes really start surfacing. So this is the yellow flag, right? It's definitely not a green flag. Closing in on a red flag. It's time to have a clear conversation and seek professional help, okay? Risky use or abuse, I call it abuse. Again, an abuse, what qualifies as abuse is using despite consequences. And like I stressed in the last episode, we don't want to think of consequences as DUIs, losing a job, getting kicked out of school, problems with the police, legal issues. Those are definitely consequences, but those are extreme examples of someone's problematic drinking or drugging. Those are only happening at the very tail end of someone's abuse/dependency. So consequences could be social, they could be minor, they could be, again, losing an internship, a friend taking space, relationship ending, some negative issues of people posting some crap about you on social because, again, you put yourself in compromised positions, whatever that is. So risky use is where someone is using it as a coping mechanism. They're escaping from stress or mental health issues. Well, the mental health issues may have been precursors. They may have started using to actually address their depression or address their anxiety. But guess what? It's exacerbating those issues, right? It's not giving their norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters the opportunities to recharge and rejuvenate themselves, particularly when you're sleeping or a teen is sleeping. That's why sleep for teens is so paramount, even though they get so little. You can't be undepressed if you're not sleeping. And if you're using, you're then forcing your brain to dump serotonin, norepinephrine, and serotonin at times throughout the day. So there's going to be a lack of that, right? At other times, and they're not going to have a healthy emotional balance. So they could even be using before school. I mean, I have clients who are vaping the first thing they wake up. I used to have a client who used to sleep with their vape literally like in her bra strap. I had another client who would sleep pretty much with their vape in their hand or right by their desk. It's like Pavlov's dogs, right? Those habits are getting really rubber stamped. Think of the phone. How many of us, myself included, at times are on the phone way too much? And if you roll over to the nightstand and there's your phone and you're scrolling now on Instagram, well, your brain is getting, again, rubber stamped with that. That's becoming habituated out. So we want to break, right? Put pauses between impulse and action. So if someone's using before school, that might be because they're trying to avoid physiological withdrawal, and they might have cravings and they might need an eye opener, which is pretty extreme, or they might be going through the beginnings of withdrawal. Even think of nicotine. I mean, I have clients who feel horrible, if they don't smoke prior to, 8:30, or, if they don't vape prior to 9 or 10 or whatever that is. Obviously, teens I've worked with in the past absolutely have driven under the influence, or absolutely have demonstrated poor social judgment, or have gotten into a car with someone who was impaired. 100%. You're going to see a lot more lying, sneaky, stealthy stuff. So if you're here as a parent, this is a red flag. Functioning starts to fall apart. Emotional reactivity increases. Your teen is going to be flying off the handle. They're going to have what's called a labile mood. That means highs and lows, right? That doesn't mean they're bipolar. Obviously, someone could have bipolarity that's being masked by addiction. But more often than not, this is addiction as the primary driver at this point, right? Help is absolutely needed. Dependency. Why is this happening? Again, now this is all about physiological, psychological reliance and loss of control. They're not feeling good. They're using just to chase that original high and to not be sick. What does it look like? There's withdrawal symptoms, there's secrecy, intense cravings, denial of a problem. Parent tip, this requires professional interventions. Parents can't love this away. You just can't. You're going to play a vital role in getting help. And that's what we're going to get into today, where we can construct a pathway forward. And what does an intervention look like? So this is my bread and butter, believe it or not. I do this every single day. There is not a week that goes by that I'm not working with a family that has a young adult, more often than not, or a late teen who is struggling now with mental health and or addiction. That's called co-occurring diagnoses, and they need help. And the 4 Peaks Parents Program is built to help them. It is 4 peaks, and you climb across these 4 peaks. And it starts with the first peak being the family audit, which is where are we, right? Let's look at this current system. What's happening? What is homeostatic? and what's going on there, right? The second is emotional mastery. How do we immediately develop the tools we need to become the masters of our emotions so our emotions aren't running roughshod all over our parenting? The third is upgrading your toolkit. And then the fourth is rewriting your family story. And believe it or not, in 90 days, I can help you and your partner, if you have one, immediately take stock of where you are and know exactly how to get out of the chaos and dysfunction and get to a place of high functionality. Along the way, a lot of times I get to have, because everything is virtual, I get to meet your late teen or young adult. And believe it or not, I don't get cursed at. They often like me, and we have really engaging conversations because it's very helpful for the families that I work with to say, hey, this is where we are. This is what's happening. Change is on the way, right? We can't stay on this island when the tsunami's rolling in. And we're going to start, making some changes and talk about things. And I coach parents immediately on how to have heart-centered, open dialogue with their loved one without yelling, screaming, using shame or blame. So many families, unfortunately, come to me a little too late when they have, rather than maintain that open dialogue, heart-centered communication, been encouraging, used motivational coaching, yelled and screamed and fell into the traditional parenting traps of trying to be the comptroller or trying to be the rescuer, or became enmeshed, or became the warden, became the controller, started drug testing. And again, my heart goes out to parents in these situations because, let's be real, your loved one can die. And unfortunately, addiction is a progressive disease. It functions like every disease, right? Where you begin is not where you end. And it is progressive. It is potentially fatal. It is curable, believe it or not. But again, it doesn't go anywhere. It's chronic. So if you got to a place of stopping your cannabis use for 2-3 days, you could go right back. If you didn't drink for 2 weeks, amazing. And that's awesome. And what a healthy reset, right, for your brain. Yet those neural pathways are just dormant, waiting to be tapped on again. And then your brain is going to be lit up like a Christmas tree. So I understand why families wear these hats and take on these roles, because you love your loved one and you have, on some level, a mild form and potentially larger form of PTSD. Because at this point, when there's a problem, every single phone call, you're keyed up and waiting for the next shoe to drop. And that could be the police or the coroner or the whatever, the principal, or that could be, whatever it is. And you've been through series of problems. And one of the things that I always try to help the families understand is that this is a family disease. It's a family illness. And so, not to say that you've caused your loved one's drug addiction or drinking or drugging. You have not. However, we unwittingly take on roles and start wearing hats. And if we're not careful, as our loved one is increasing tolerance for their drinking or drug, we begin to increase tolerance for their behavior. As our loved one is starting to experience social emotional consequences, guess what? We start experiencing social, emotional, physiological consequences. They're decreasing sleep or increasing sleep. We're having sleep changes, right? They're having mood changes. We're having mood changes. They can all of a sudden be entering into some shame and or secrecy and or denial. We could be doing the same thing if we're not careful. Rather than leaning toward our partner or leaning toward Al-Anon, which is a great support group for parents, or obviously the Four Peaks Parents Program, we start isolating, we start pushing down and pushing away some of these things. I'm sure all of you, not all of you, many of you have seen or smelt or saw or felt something, and you're like, yeah, I don't know. And you pushed it away. That's denial, right? A lot of families, when they're on the other side and they're now moving through the Four Peaks and we're kicking booty, and they got, they're definitely at the second peak of emotional mastery, or the third peak, which is upgrading their toolkit. Now all of a sudden they're like, holy shit. Like, I realized I've been like kind of looking the other way or minimizing for a really long time. I've been justifying a whole bunch of behaviors, and everything starts getting clearer and clearer, right? During the Four Peaks Parents Program, many many times I connect families with therapeutic consultants or interventionists. The reason I'm having this topic right now, because just the other week, it was like probably about 2 weeks ago, I connected a family mid-program. I was like, hey, people, this is where we are. You're at a place of, your loved one's at a place of abuse bordering on dependency, like straddling those two worlds. And it's a progressive disease. So they're going to continue to normalize, right? Develop greater and greater physiological addiction, right? Psychological addiction, go through greater and greater withdrawals, have, less and less and less opportunities to choose choices, let's say. We need an intervention. And I connected them with an interventionist, and their loved one's now in a program. Just about a month ago, same thing. I was working with a family that, reached out for support because they were kind of in the yellow zone. And very quickly, their 18-year-old continued to increase their use to the point where they rapidly progressed through the stages of change amidst the program. So I always say to the families that, it's so great you pulled that trigger and that you have me, because not only are you getting me in the program with all the videos that are incredibly insightful and open their eyes and give them in real time things that they can do in between our sessions. They also have access to the workbook where they're working through and developing new approaches, new skills. And I get to see that live because it's a Google Doc. They also get a troubleshooting call for 20 minutes and an hour-long individual session, or if they choose the group model, a 90-minute group. But guess what? Their loved ones are progressing or regressing in real time. And so without having me as that sounding board and or that Sherpa, they really would be alone. And that disease, model, if you will, would, since it is progressive, since it is potentially fatal, and it is curable, they would be managing all of that on their own. And unfortunately, what happens, particularly with young adults, when you enter a young adult or even a teen into traditional outpatient therapy, a lot of times therapists, believe it or not, are not addiction specialists, and they do not understand the stages of the disease model, right? They do not understand the difference between experimentation versus occasional versus regular versus, abuse or risky use or dependency. And they're also surprisingly, which kills me when I used to be a clinical director and obviously a supervisor, and I was a founder, and I was a family wellness director. It's amazing how many clinicians are not trained in motivational interviewing, which is an evidence-based modality to motivate a client for change, and to do it in a way that is actually very strength-based and very positive psychology-based, where there's an opportunity for that client to gain the insights and then to also choose the choice and choose certain changes and create buy-in. So through the 4 Peaks program, these families not only become experts in how to do motivational interviewing / coaching with their loved one, to the point that their loved one's not even aware of it. And it changes the conversation and the dynamic from that of this adversarial gatekeeper, yeller, screamer, warden, or enabler, rescuer, to sort of colleague with definitely, obviously, an emphasis on coach and an emphasis on, supportive challenger person. And you begin to hold the frame. I talk about that all the time. No longer are you going to allow your loved one to manipulate the narrative, particularly if they're living in your house. Believe it or not, you have a lot to leverage. And I help the families not only match their loved one toward an outcome maybe that they're ready for, but also pace their pace with them, meaning not ask them to be sober today, but begin to get them to look at change and then find a way to create what's called the greater view. And so these are all videos. They're literally videos and sessions. And then there's a worksheet surrounding where they have to practice, rehearse, role play with themselves or their co-partner, so that it shifts how you have these conversations. Because you have to understand, you're not dealing with a rational brain, right? If you have a loved one who is drinking, drugging, right? They're literally going through trauma every day. We need to have empathy and understand that this is a medical, psychological issue. This is not just simply about willpower, and they're not just being an asshole as much as they might be being an asshole, right? So we need to have empathy for our loved ones, right? That they are in fact going through a brain disease, right? That is changing everything, their ability to process information, how they're managing their emotions, their sleep is whacked out, right? Their emotional reactivity is keyed up, or their energy is high, it's low. They're just not well. They're not doing well. And so a lot of times families, it's very understandable, but they personalize every little thing, or they go to their loved one assuming to have this rational conversation about something that's so obvious that you could see 2020 that they clearly need help, but they're not ready. So through the program, through our work, I coach parents to match and mirror, right? And also create discrepancies, because we always want to create and search for ambivalence, meaning that there's definitely some aspect of your loved one's life that, as much as they may not be ready for sobriety, they sure don't love every aspect. And there's ways we can leverage that. And again, words like "do you realize" or "have you noticed" are great. Have you noticed that you've really been distancing yourself from your friends? If someone, again, used to be super passionate about whatever it is, do you realize you haven't done cheerleading in a really long time? Or have you noticed that you haven't shot hoops in forever and basketball season's a couple of weeks away? Doesn't seem like you've gone outside that much. What's up with that? So we really want to try to create, again, not anxiety, but a little like, a little irritation in a helpful way, where we're trying to orient them toward recognizing what's amiss or what's shifted. If your loved one has clearly going through withdrawal, and it would be incredibly rare that your loved one says, "Hey, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I need a program today." That would be amazing. But that unfortunately doesn't happen, right? More often than not, in my line of work and in this field, every interventionist I've ever worked with, every therapeutic consultant I've ever worked with, every family I've ever worked with, is we more often than not have to be the change agents, right? We see what they can't see. And so we need to make it known to our loved one, right, that we believe they have a problem. And there's many ways to do this, right? So a couple of conversation starters are, hey, like I just already said, the "have you noticed, do you realize?" That's a great one. Something as simple as even, can we talk about, something I've noticed? I'm not mad, I just care. Have you ever felt like drinking or using helped you feel less anxious or sad? That's an easy one. They don't have to own they're an addict. One of my favorites comes from, it's an acronym called CAGE, which stands for cravings, annoyed, guilt, or eye opener. The annoyed question is great because you ask, have you ever, or are you currently annoyed by anyone like talking to you about your drinking? They don't even have to say, I have a drinking problem. They just get to say, yeah, I can't stand, oh my God, Monique, she's like up my butt all the time about whatever. I can't stand, Daryl, he's always like riding me about my drinking, or whoever, James, It's great because they don't have to own, right, that they have a major issue. Or even something as simple as like, is there any friend that you have? I'm not here to be a rat or anything, but is there anyone that you're really concerned about that you think is kind of like, I know you're, mentioned you're using, pot here and there to kind of cope with stress, but is there anyone that like you feel like is kind of like pretty extreme, or like, really losing control? That's kind of a nice way. The key is, even though you're scared, I know it's so freaking hard, you got to try to stay calm. And do not ever ambush your child with multiple people in the room, unless, of course, that's an intervention. And in that case, reach out. I will help you long before you ever do an intervention, figure out where you are in this journey and how to help you begin to start the process. And then, of course, connect you with an interventionist. Avoid ultimatums unless there's a safety issue. You're not going to fix it in one talk, okay? So just to like really paint the picture in case we're not super clear of what abuse looks like. I mean, if you're finding substances or paraphernalia regularly, if your child obviously is becoming violent, suicidal, or detached, again, grades collapse, dropping out of school, not working, isolating, playing video games all day long, not going outside, not functional, right? I mean, Freud talked about someone has to be occupational. They have to work, they have to laugh, they have to love, right? That's really just a simple way of thinking about it. If someone's not working, laughing as in having a full range of emotions and mood, and they're not loving as they're not relational and can't connect, that's a problem. Key easy one, if you currently feel like you're walking on eggshells, please reach out. There's nothing that kills me more than to see parents who are walking on eggshells in their own home. I never forget a family I was coaching probably about 4 years ago had literally moved into the attic of their own house. They had ceded ground, the first and second floor of their house, to their loved one. That's not a good look, people, right? It's your house. We got to take some power back. We can't allow addiction to bloom and just to bury our heads in the sand and avoid and think that's, really effective. It's not, right? Avoidance is not a strategy. So, again, like you pretty much, it's got to be clear to you already that, if your loved one has a problem, right, you got to do something. Okay. And there's many ways to do something. So you can Google as we speak, Al-Anon or Nar-Anon. Those are free programs for parents. That's just for parents. Nar-Anon would be a group for, not just parents, just for families. Nar-Anon would be a support group that's free, anonymous, for families that have a loved one that they think might be engaging in narcotics. Al-Anon is for families that have a loved one who is drinking too much. So obviously, your loved one, if they were somehow at all motivated to go check out an AA or NA meeting, amazing. If your loved one is motivated to work with an individual therapist, great. Again, the only problem is a lot of individual therapists are not addiction specialists and don't have the training that I have and aren't trained, unfortunately, in addition to, of course, cognitive behavioral therapy like I'm trained in, and dialectical behavioral therapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction, and exposure response prevention, which is for OCD. They don't have the substance abuse training I have, right? So you really want to make sure that someone, if you're going with an outpatient clinician, they have substance abuse training. I worked inpatient at an addiction treatment center. I was the family wellness director. Along with an amazing team, we built a wonderful, robust family program because, again, addiction's a family disease. I also have hours and hours and hours of clinical trainings, again, in things such as motivational interviewing, motivational coaching, or neuro-linguistic programming, which is a way to encourage someone to change, right? And to really use, good levers that are things that you can, help encourage them and agitate a change process in a way where you're moving them through those stages of change. You're moving them from pre-contemplative to contemplating change, to preparing for change, to action, to maintenance. And it's not just looking at them in a black and white fashion. So you really want to make sure that it's a good outpatient therapist that's trained in mental health and addiction. And the annoying thing is, once they get connected, if they're an adult, you're pretty much locked out of that process. And a lot of therapists, unfortunately, kick the can and continue working with someone well beyond what, in my opinion, is medically necessary or clinically appropriate, because you really want to make sure you have a therapist that is going to immediately involve the family and try to agitate a change process. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that's not the case. And that's, again, why I built this program, to give families tools in real time, tips and tools and strategies and approaches so that they can take action, because we don't want this to continue to bloom on our watch, right? So if there's immediate, obviously, risk-taking behavior that's really scary, you need help today, right? Families in the past I've worked with have explored the idea of sectioning their loved one. If obviously your loved one is engaging in any kind of suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, absolutely act immediately, call the authorities, call 911, get your loved one to be evaluated immediately and have, them placed inpatient for, crisis and safety monitoring. However, while that's great and maybe saving their lives, you really want to make sure you're getting them the right level of care. And so there's a big difference between outpatient, which is once a week, and intensive outpatient, which is more often than not 4 or 5 times a week, and often 5 hours. It might be 12 to 5. It might be 5 to 9 if there's an evening IOP. And that's going to take place for about potentially 2 to 4 weeks. So if your loved one is motivated for some level of support and they're not ready for inpatient and they have no desire whatsoever for sobriety, but they're willing to meet with an outpatient clinician. Obviously take that, because hopefully, again, they become an inside person who's working with your loved one to decrease some of their stress and anxiety, give them some coping skills, right? Mindfulness, cognitive behavioral, DBT, whatever, just to decrease some of their maybe concerns, shift their thinking, but ideally really challenge them to take a look at their use and begin to make decisions, as well as motivating them hopefully for change. But IOP is an intensive outpatient, much more robust than a once a week outpatient therapist. And then you have inpatient, where of course a good inpatient, by the way, is really going to work with someone until they have enough recovery skills, right, to return. Doesn't even mean that they're returning back to the community, because that inpatient may be recommending what's called aftercare, which more often than not looks like a structured sober living program where they're living with other people right around their age who are also in recovery and might have more recovery time, so they can benefit, right, from what it looks like to be a part of a vibrant, high functioning group of men and women. They're usually single sex, where immediately they're gonna be going to AA or NA. They're gonna be a part of a community. They're gonna be relational. They're gonna have people to lean upon to support them. But they're also gonna be expected to get on with their life and to get a job and to of course connect with whatever resources they need, whether that be a therapist, an acupuncturist, that could be a life coach in there, recovery coach in there. But ostensibly, that's the final step of someone's recovery. And inpatient, more often than not, if we're talking about dependency, is going to be the right level of care, because that person may or may not be going through withdrawal, and they may or may not need detox, because if they don't receive the proper care on the front end and they're not comfortable and they're not bought in, right, it's going to be very hard for that person to buy in to a bigger version or bigger vision of what recovery is. And the beauty of an inpatient program is that they can really get, fantastic care and be surrounded by world-class, ideally a good program anyway, clinicians, nutritionists, family peace. They can begin to wipe off the shame and stigma of those behaviors. And then they can obviously, be benefiting from, of course, being exposed to 12-step, that's AA and NA, as well as individual therapy, group work. There can be an element also, of course, of exercise and nutrition, and just beginning to heal from the trauma that has been that brain disease. The longer someone is in treatment, the better the outcome. We know this from the research. You got to understand this is a brain disease. And if you look at MRIs of the brain, not to say nothing's happening in those first 28 days, but more often than not, someone is still in what's called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. That's PAWS, PAWS, meaning that, the light bulb hasn't really come back on. And so if someone has been going through trauma and their brain they've been addicted and they've gone through physiological, psychological dependency, it's very hard for them to get excited, right, about a life of recovery at the 28-day mark. So if someone is able to really do some great work and the family sets this process up for success, of course, with a coach and someone like myself to really be that guide, and then I, of course, can connect you with fantastic consultants or great programs that really know what they're doing and are going to create buy-in and hook your loved one in, the outcomes are that much better. And then there can be an opportunity for them to work with someone on the aftercare side to explore what's next, because recovery needs to be the most important thing for them. As much as your loved one is going to find every reason in the world not even to be able to work with an outpatient therapist, or never mind an IOP or an inpatient. So again, whatever your loved one is willing to do, take at that time. But if you need a guide and a coach and a Sherpa to help your family figure out the next right step, please reach out, because not all recovery programs are created equal. Not all, levels of care are the right levels of care. And you really want to get this right, because that window of opportunity slams shut so quick, and it's so easy for your loved one to relapse and get back into, unfortunately, some of those unhealthy norms and unhealthy using behaviors again. So if you're concerned, please reach out. Go to 4peaksparents.com, book a discovery call. It's free. We can jump on a call and I can learn more about your unique situation and explore whether or not I feel I can help you. Between now and then, obviously, check out Nar-Anon, Al-Anon for you as a family resource. Obviously, if your loved one has any level of openness tonight and they're willing to explore AA or NA or work with an outpatient clinician, wonderful. Again, that may or may not be enough, but it's a great start. Do not lose hope. Realize, again, this is a brain disease. The beauty of this brain disease, unlike some diseases, is that it's actually treatable, very treatable. Some would argue curable. I tend to think more on the treatment side, and because it is a chronic disease, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's really more about, can someone get into a place of recovery? And the beauty of addiction is the answer is yes, right? So your loved one, despite all of the pain and suffering that they're experiencing and you're experiencing, believe it or not, there's a way forward, right? And it just starts with one courageous step, either of you or them. Ideally, though, it's probably not ideally, more likely than not, it will probably be you raising your hand and saying, hey, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and something has to change. And whatever you do, don't let fear show up in your story. Just take action today. Be courageous today, because trying to take these symptoms down later on, when they're even more entrenched and rooted, will be that much harder. Okay? You can do this. I believe in you. Thank you so much for listening. Never, ever lose hope. And please, if you haven't already, sign up for my newsletter. You could easily do that through my website, 4peaksparents.com, or check out in the show notes. There's immediate access to the newsletter where you can get tips, tools, and strategies right to your inbox. Have a wonderful day. Be well. Hey everyone, Thomas here. First off, it means the world to me that you took the time to listen to my podcast. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Also, if you want to receive the latest podcast updates, as well as expert parenting tips and practical strategies for navigating your tween, teen, or young adults' challenges directly to your inbox, then sign up for my newsletter. The link is in the description. And most importantly, if you're tired of feeling overwhelmed, stuck, stressed, and are losing sleep because you're constantly worried about your tween, teen, or young adult, your first step is to realize that you still have a choice and can do something about it. I'm ready to help you take action and create the results you desire today. Just go to 4peaksparents.com and book a free strategy call. Let's do this. Last thing, while you were listening to this show, who was the one person that you thought could really benefit from hearing it? Please share it with them.